Hi, Natalie, Shaden, and Anderson. Sorry, I was trying to adjust my book here. Here is the rest of chapter 12. It starts on page 158. So please make sure that you have your book and can read along with me. I'm going to start right where my sticky note is. The land sloped uphill. Parrots and toucans, chattered in the canted afternoon light that sifted through the primordial trees. Guadalupe fell into step beside Addison. What happened to your aunt and uncle, anyway? They were kidnapped in New York. Guadalupe considered this. Usually, New Yorkers have to come to Columbia to get kidnapped. We do things differently in my family. Addison parted his way through the overhanging vines, careful he was not accidentally grasping at tree snakes. You must be close to your aunt and uncle to come all this way. Addison weighed the question. Well, they're separated, so we only see my uncle on weekends, and they work a lot, but they're the closest things to parents I've got. Guadalupe nodded. Addison knew Guadalupe lived on her own. He felt she might understand his situation. Molly and I are on our own a lot. They're hardly around. It's kind of selfish, right? People who raise kids and never see them, like they're only thinking of themselves. Guadalupe hiked for a moment in silence. She studied Addison thoughtfully. They didn't choose to have you, right? I mean, they're not your real parents. Exactly. And yet, they took you in when you needed them, even though they have to work harder. They don't sound like they're only thinking for themselves, said Guadalupe, but you do. She walked on ahead. Addison watched the afternoon sunlight filter through the wind-rippled leaves. He plodded along in thoughtful silence, the gently sloping forest floor muffling the sound of his footfalls. The sun drew lower, and the group made camp for the night. Raj collected stones to build a fire circle. Eddie and Molly gathered firewood. Addison and Guadalupe walked to a nearby creek to refill the water bottles. Addison sat down on the mossy bank and stripped off his shoes and socks. He stared in dismay at his jacket and trousers caked in mud. This is the dirtiest I've ever been. You can wash your jacket in the creek, said Guadalupe. Will that work? She shrugged. It can't get any dirtier. Addison felt she had a point, so he waded into the cooling water. The evening air hummed pleasantly with a chorus of crickets and cicadas. Guadalupe followed him into the shallows, scrubbing dried mud from the knees of her pants. She waded past her hips and elbows until the water reached up to her chin. How did you end up here from Cleveland? Addison asked. I told you before, it's complicated. Try me. When my parents divorced, my mother left Cleveland and took us to live with her parents here in South America. She only waited a year before getting married again. I didn't like my new stepfather. I couldn't stand being in the house, so I left. But you said you're an orphan. After I left, they were in a car accident, said Guadalupe. Addison slipped deeper into the water. He watched the gently running creek slowly dissolve the caked mud from his jacket. He tried to think of the right thing to say. That's terrible. I'm really sorry. What do you know about it? Snapped Guadalupe. You're just some rich boy from New York. I'm not rich. Compared to me, you are. Addison treaded water and did not look at Guadalupe. Her words bothered him. She probably saw his blazer and tie and assumed he led a charmed life. Somehow, Addison wanted her to know he shared the same problems she did. My parents died when I was 8, he said finally. Guadalupe swam in silence, the water lapping against the edges of the tidal pool. Crickets and night frogs hurled at the dusk with chirps and purring trills. What happened? We were in Cambodia, Addison began, in the Dangrek Mountains, a site called the Temple of God. Guadalupe squinted her eyes and looked at him closely. Molly and I grew up all over the world, said Addison. My parents were like gypsies. We lived on hippie communes, slept on steamboats, and once crossed Egypt with a Bedouin caravan. My parents would do whatever they needed to reach an archaeological site. I come from a very weird family. That explains a lot. All the Cookes are archaeologists. My father, mother, aunt, and both my uncles. It's sort of our family business. It takes us around the globe. Why were you in Cambodia? Asked Guadalupe. My parents wanted to find an artifact called the Crown of Sita. I didn't know it at the time, but later my uncle explained it. Khmer smugglers were looting artifacts and selling them to buy weapons. My parents wanted to rescue the crown from the temple and secure it in a museum before the smugglers could steal it. This was your childhood? She stifled a laugh. Look, do you want to hear my story or not? I do, said Guadalupe. Sorry. So what happened? Everything went wrong. The sky went dark and we were trapped by monsoon rain. We couldn't escape. Khmer smugglers surrounded the temple and attacked. Your parents put an 8-year-old in this situation? Addison, you may have worse parents than I do. They couldn't have known we'd be ambushed. I guess, said Guadalupe, shaking her head. My uncle Nigel ran with Molly and me. We hid in the jungle. All we could do was watch from the trees. Addison treaded water, silently for a while before he continued. Molly was too young to remember, but I can close my eyes and see it like it was yesterday. He took a breath. I remember the mountains, thunder and lightning crashing all around. I remember my mother using vines to climb the temple wall on the edge of the cliff. She was trying to escape before the smugglers could catch her. The cliff was thousands of feet high. Just as she made it to the top of the wall, Addison's voice trailed off. Guadalupe watched him quietly. What about your father? I never saw him again. The crescent moon rose high above the palms, reflecting its pallid light in the purling ripples of the tidal pool. I've never told anyone about that, not even Raj or Eddie. You probably want me to say something kind or thoughtful, said Guadalupe, or to tell you it will all be okay, but I don't believe that. Algunos cortes son demasiado profundos para sanar. Some cuts are too deep to heal. Addison listened to the lapping of the water and the breeze wafting palm fronds in the darkly suspirant forest. Finally, Guadalupe spoke again. At the waterfall, you swam to help me. Why did you do that? I'm not sure, it just happened. Well, you could have died. A person should look out for themselves. Guadalupe, I don't know how we're going to make it through this if we don't help each other, said Addison. Moonlight played on the water, casting dancing reflections on Guadalupe's face. At last, she swam close to him. She fished in her pocket for a moment. Here, she said, handing Addison his uncle's wallet. I picked it from you when you pulled me from the river today. Thanks, said Addison. Night fell, and the hushed forest came to life with hoots and howls in the darkness. Guadalupe had forgotten to bring forks, so the group ate dinner with their hands. They hunched over the fire, gulping down beans, rice, corn, chorizo, plantains, and cuy. Whoa, said Eddie, covering his mouth and grimacing. Do not eat the cuy. Way ahead of you, said Molly. I don't know, I kind of like it, said Raj, helping himself to more. The tired group gazed into the campfire, watching it crackle and snap. We never found that Incan trail you promised, said Molly. We'll reach it tomorrow, Addison replied in what he hoped was a confident tone. I'm sure of it. Do you think it's true that what Uncle Nigel said about the Incan treasure being cursed? Asked Molly. Well, no treasure hunter who's gone after it has made it back alive. Addison tried a little cuy, just to be open-minded. He decided it tasted like chicken. Nobody told me about a curse, said Guadalupe, finishing her dinner and leaning back against a log. Yeah, me neither, said Eddie. You somehow left that part out, Addison. Addison poked the fire with a stick. 300 years ago, a Spanish adventurer named Valverde married an Incan princess. He led an expedition into the mountains to the secret spot where she claimed the treasure was hidden. They never returned. Raj busied himself in the dark, setting protective booby traps around the camp. He had already dug several deep pits, bristling with sharpened bamboo stakes, and was now struggling to engineer a complex snare trap of saplings and vines. 100 years later, Addison continued, a pair of treasure hunters named Captain Blake and Lieutenant Chaplin claimed they found Valverde's map. They led a party into the mountains and disappeared in a rockslide. Raj, now thoroughly intrigued, joined the campfire and listened eagerly with the rest of the team. In the 1930s, said Addison, a Scotsman named Erskine Locke mounted a treasure hunt in the forests of the Andes. Torrential rains drove his men to fever and hallucinations. His porters deserted. Locke was found stabbed to death through the heart. Death, the long sleep of the hereafter, said Raj, wide-eyed. So there is a curse. The fire crackled in the lonely night. Look, said Addison, sensing the fearful mood of his team, none of those explorers found what we found. The first 2 Incan keys. This gives us a huge competitive edge. Besides, I don't believe in ghost stories. It was at that moment that Molly split the night with a blood-curdling scream. A spotted anaconda, coiled around a low-hanging tree limb, dropped onto Molly. The 10-foot constrictor wrapped its muscled body around her legs, then waist, and worked its way up her chest. Molly hollered again. Don't shout, yelped Raj, leaping to his feet. The snake will squeeze the air out of your chest. What should I do? Gasped Molly, struggling against the wriggling snake. Just fill your lungs and hold your breath. Guadalupe felt a flood of adrenaline surge through her body. Thinking quickly, she grabbed a flaming brand from the fire and lunged at the great serpent. It hissed viciously, tightening its grip on Molly, and wrapped a coil around her throat. Addison followed Guadalupe's suit. He snatched a glowing stick from the fire, danced from foot to foot like a fencer, and slashed at the reptile's face. Raj hefted a burning log, half his own size, and speared it toward the snake. Ow! Snarled Molly, grasping a free hand toward her singed leg. Sorry, Raj called, hopping backward for balance. He held the burning log to the anaconda's tail, branding its mottled skin so that its flesh sizzled and filled the night air with a faint smell of barbecue. The snake tightened its grip on Molly's throat. Her face began to turn blue. Raj grabbed more burning sticks, handing them to Guadalupe and Addison. They singed the snake again and again. At last, the enraged serpent decided that enough was enough. The Amazon was a big place, and there were easier meals to be had. The anaconda released Molly with a savage hiss and retreated from the flaming brands. The massive snake barber pulled up a mahogany tree and vanished into the slithering shadows. Gotta watch out for those, said Guadalupe. It's a jungle out there, Addison agreed. Thanks, breathed Molly, panting for breath. She clutched her burnt leg. I have a first aid kit, Raj cried, still jittery from the attack. He rifled through his backpack and came up with iodine and bandages. He examined the red and swollen burn. Does it hurt? I'll give you one guess. Molly gritted her teeth and didn't make a sound as Raj cleaned the wound and bandaged it up. It's a good thing, I have to say here, 4th grade friends, that Raj, this character, came fully prepared. Like, he really, truly knows about surviving out in the wilderness. Molly, said Raj, shaking his head in admiration, you're not like any of my sisters. Thanks, Molly said again. She climbed to her feet and tested her leg. Chin up, Mo, said Addison. Nobody said discovering 750 tons of treasure would be a walk in the park. Nobody said it would be a walk in the jungle either, Molly grumbled. I need to get back to his city, Guadalupe said, staring distrustfully at the overhanging branches. Even getting pinched by the policia is better than this. Addison could find no flaw in her reasoning. The good news is we now know the snakes are afraid of fire. He sat down and made himself look as relaxed as possible. We just stay close to the campfire tonight and we'll be fine. Molly sat down and inched as close as she could get to the flames without catching fire. Thanks, Guadalupe, she said. It took a team a long time to fall asleep that night. They stared up at the few stars visible through the jungle's curtain. Raj asked Eddie at last, "What will you do with your share of the Incan treasure?" "Rent my own apartment so I don't have to share space with my 3 sisters." "You really have 3 sisters?" asked Guadalupe. "It's my cross to bear." "What else would you do with the treasure?" asked Eddie. "It could be worth millions." Raj scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I'd change my last name to Dark Star, and then I'd go to survival camp in Montana." "What about you?" "With that much gold, I'd buy a glass submarine. I'd buy a jacuzzi you can drive down the street. I'd buy Restaurant Anatolia. I'd buy our school, tear it down, and turn it into a skate park. I'd build a mansion out of cupcakes and eat my way through it. I'd buy a skyscraper and fill each floor with water and goldfish. I'd hire the Dallas Cowboys to be my personal bodyguard. I'd build a fire engine that shoots Nutella from fire hoses." "You've given this some thought," said Guadalupe. "A bit," Eddie admitted. "I don't have brothers or sisters, so I have time on my hands." "Addison, what will you do with the treasure?" asked Raj. "Probably give my share to a museum," said Addison. "What I really care about is finding it before Professor Rhaegar." "And what about you, Molly?" asked Raj. "I don't care about the treasure," she said simply. "I just want to rescue Aunt Delia and Uncle Nigel." Addison woke the next morning, pleased to find he was quite alive and not being digested inside the belly of a snake. Raj checked his booby traps. Guadalupe stoked the campfire back to life, heating up rice, beans, and corn for their breakfast. Eddie watched the food steam, his mouth watering. Addison rose and stretched his sore muscles. He opened his notebook and read the second Incan clue for the 47th time. Across the mighty Amazon, through the jungles of the headhunters, follow the footsteps of the Incas. In a castle on the edge of the world, the key is hidden closest to the gods. Molly raised herself up on one elbow and squinted her eyes. "Addison, did you hear something?" "Nothing in particular." "In the bushes over there, I heard a mumbling." "That's just your stomach," said Addison. "Rise and shine, Mo. Shove a little breakfast into the cook's stomach and enjoy this beautiful morning." Molly sat up and rubbed her eyes. "It's funny. It's just that I'm pretty sure I heard something." "I'm sure it's nothing," said Addison. The next second, the air was filled with deafening war cries. 50 Malako headhunters sprouted from the jungle, spears held high over their heads. Their faces were painted red and their ears and noses pierced with bone. They barreled full speed toward Addison like stones from a slingshot. "John Wilkes Booth!" yelped Addison. "See, I told you!" shouted Molly, jumping to her feet. "A brisk run will aid the Constitution," suggested Addison, taking flight. Addison, Molly, Raj, and Guadalupe plunged headlong into the underbrush. Eddie brought up the rear, huffing and puffing. "Run like the wind, Eddie!" cried Addison. "I'm trying," gasped Eddie. "You run like a mild breeze," shouted Molly. She was pleased to find that her burnt leg didn't seem to slow down her feet. The Malako tribesmen were not kidding around. They hurtled right over the booby traps Raj had set, catching up quickly. Their screams rattled in Addison's ears, chilling him to the bone. Addison's team leapt over tree roots and ducked under branches, and sometimes were forced to do both at the same time. The vegetation grew so thick, Addison couldn't see 3 feet ahead of him. So Addison was as surprised as anyone when he and the group raced right over the edge of a ravine. They skidded down the steep dirt slope on their backs, grasping at roots and stones to slow their descent. The Malako lost ground, choosing a more sensible detour down to the gully. Addison's group scrambled to their feet, clumps of leaves matting their hair, and kept right on moving. Their route led them directly up the next steep hill. Soon they were out of breath, gulping for air like beached trout. Addison was already sore from yesterday's hike, and this life-or-death sprint was not particularly helping matters. He wondered how long he could keep running without any breakfast. "Look out this time!" cried Guadalupe, skidding to a halt. The jungle opened up to reveal a 100-foot drop to a deep rock gorge, a fast-moving river gushing far below. "Benedict Arnold," cursed Addison. Raj found a dangling jungle vine and took a running start. He screamed his battle cry at the top of his lungs. "Bandari!" The team watched in amazement as Raj swung all 30 feet across the rocky chasm. He crashed into the bushes on the far side in an explosion of leaves and squawking birds. "Let's just take this footbridge," Molly suggested, pointing a few feet to the left. The team wasted no time in agreeing. The hemp rope bridge. Oh, fourth graders, I think this part right here is the picture that we're seeing. There's Raj swinging from the vine across the big chasm, and then you can see the other kids running across it, and then the arrows from the Malako tribesmen. You see that? The team watched in amazement as Raj swung all 30 feet across the rocky chasm. He crashed into the bushes on the far side in an explosion of leaves and squawking birds. "Let's just take this footbridge," Molly suggested, pointing a few feet to the left. The team wasted no time in agreeing. The hemp rope bridge danced and shivered as they raced across the raging river, rushing a dizzying 100 feet below. "Destroy the bridge," Addison called. Reaching the far side, he and Guadalupe dropped to their knees and tugged at the stakes anchoring the rope. Bridge to the cliff. Just as the Malako reached the bridge, it snapped apart, wilting to the far wall of the gorge. The furious tribesmen shouted at Addison from across the canyon. They sent poison-tipped spears and darts raining down on the group. "We should probably keep moving," said Guadalupe, ducking an incoming arrow. "Wait," said Addison. "There wouldn't just be a footbridge here for no reason." He squatted low to the ground, scanned the terrain, and cried out in triumph. "There!" he cried, pointing to a stone marker. "The Incan trail! I knew it!" "Sure you did," said Molly. She took off down the trail, the group following at her heels. "Some people are so hard to impress," Addison muttered. A Malako spear clattered to the ground by his feet. Addison scurried after Molly. A few miles later, the team relaxed to a slow march, exhaustion written on their dirt-lined faces. The Incan trail petered out to a pathway, dwindled down to a rut, and finally fizzled out altogether. Raj beat a path for them through the jungle, pounding the vegetation with a stick. The forest grew lighter up ahead. Suddenly, Raj stopped and uttered a cry. The group caught up to him and peered through the bushes. "What is it now?" gasped Eddie, wheezing for air. "The end of the world," said Addison. The team gazed beyond the edges of the jungle. Sheer cliffs dropped away 1,000 feet below them. The Pacific Ocean spread its arms 10,000 miles wide to embrace the curve of the world. Majestic waves rolled across the panorama to pound the rocky shore. "Look!" cried Molly, pointing to an outcropping along the coastline below. A stone bridge joined the land with a small island. And on this small island stood an impossibly large stone structure perched impossibly high on an impossibly thin jetty of land. Waves crashed against its stone foundation, casting rainbows glinting in the midday sun. Like an image from a fairy tale, its rounded turrets and pointed spires proudly presided over the gray-blue sea. It was a castle.